Buenas tardes a todos. Primero, disculpas por la tardanza, algunos problemas técnicos siempre del directo. Continuamos hoy con Jennifer Greene, va a dar su primer seminario, los que ya estuvisteis ayer, bueno, en general todo el mundo ya la conoce, sobre tradiciones del análisis cualitativo y aproximaciones generales a la narrativa, ¿vale? Entonces, cuando quieras, Jennifer, para ir a cortar lo que
Good afternoon, buenas tardes. Thank you again for this kind invitation to spend some more time with all of you, to share some of my ideas, thoughts, and experiences regarding qualitative methods, methodologies, perspectives on the social world. In this presentation, I will be defining qualitative inquiry quite broadly, quite generally and broadly. And what I'd like to do is use qualitative inquiry to refer to the systematic process of gathering, analyzing, and reporting empirical information in forms other than numbers in an effort to more deeply understand social phenomena. So the forms could be words, pictures, visions, artwork, dance. There's a lot of other forms of information about human life that aren't numerical. As most of you likely know, there are quite a lot of qualitative inquiry traditions, ranging from ethnography, case study, narrative inquiry, and more. These traditions today also roam through even a wider range of philosophical traditions, paradigmatic traditions, that today include critical race ideology, different kinds of cultural ideologies, reclaimed indigenous epistemologies, native ways of viewing the world, post-structural and post-colonial paradigms, and even post-qualitative landscapes. I bumped into post-qualitative a couple of months ago, and if there's interest, we can talk a little bit more about that. I am not an expert in any of those particular epistemologies or paradigms of qualitative inquiry, which is one reason, for me, it makes sense to define it quite broadly and generally. If some of you are expert in a particular constructivist or interpretive, otherwise qualitative paradigm and epistemology, please feel free to bring it up and we can talk about it. Please be assured this is not a lecture on what I just said. I'm not knowledgeable enough to talk about all those different paradigms, nor about all the different genres of qualitative inquiry itself, how they differ from one another, and which ones might be best for different kinds of questions. Instead, what I'd like to do is to make this as interactive a presentation as we can. So there's more than just me talking, because everybody has something to say and to offer. And what I'd like to do is something that's not listed on the topics for today, but I believe is quite important. I'd like to start with a set of propositions that I will present regarding the character of social inquiry broadly. Social inquiry is. So I would like to present a set of 6 propositions which overlap somewhat. 2 will be presented together. That I believe can be broad statements of the character of social inquiry. These will be followed by a little bit of conversation among you, or reflections on your own for each proposition, about how well what's stated on the screen fits with what you think qualitative inquiry is. And each person might consider this issue of fit. Does this statement about social inquiry is fit with what you think qualitative inquiry is? And if so, great. If not, how would you change it? So it does fit. The conversation and then we will talk about it a little bit. And that talking is not to pick the best one or to pick the right one or to say this one's the best. It's really more to help us differentiate one qualitative tradition from another so that we're informed collectively about who's in the room and what kind of standpoint you're taking on that. Particularly differentiate qualitative inquiry from mainstream quantitative inquiry, and to a smaller extent, critical social inquiry traditions. It's also in that conversation about different propositions to illuminate the many different traditions of qualitative inquiry that are present in this room and in the world. So to enhance our collective understanding of where our own views about qualitative inquiry fit within the larger landscape. I hope this sounds interesting to you. If it doesn't, or if it's boring, we will go through these propositions quite quickly. Because this is the intent is to make this relevant, interesting, and important. So, before we get started with that, I would like to make a brief statement that locates myself in what I'm about to say. This is pretty standard in qualitative inquiry traditions. Who am I? What do I bring to this inquiry? How is who I am going to be present in the inquiry and what I learn from it? So, my point here is to model what I think is appropriate qualitative inquiry practice by giving you a sense of where I'm coming from when I use that label. And also to pick up this question of locating oneself in qualitative inquiry, again in the propositions. A long time ago, in 1976, was when I earned my PhD, so very long for many of you, in an educational psychology program that featured many methods courses, all within the quantitative post-positivist tradition, although it was not labeled. So at that time, we weren't labeling or acknowledging that what we were learning about methodology was only one set of options. That was not part of what we did, what people thought at that time. My first job was in a small educational research and evaluation center at the University of Rhode Island, which is in the northeast corner of the United States. I joined over a dozen new PhDs, so that was quite fun, to be a dozen other people just finishing graduate school. And this was at the end of the US government's mid-20th century effort to eliminate social and economic inequities in our society, known to us in America as the Great Society Programs. They had been going on for about a decade. There was this idealism at that time that we might be able to offer a few programs and poverty would go away. Obviously that didn't happen. Our evaluation work at that center, however, did focus on these kind of Great Society programs that were sponsored by the federal government. What we were evaluating were local versions of federal mandates or federal programs, mostly in school systems around Rhode Island, focusing on how well the intervention helped students increase their academic performance. This work was the beginning of my lifetime love affair with evaluation. If you're not an evaluator, it probably sounds very strange. But what I valued most about being an evaluator was this genuine possibility of using my methodological knowledge and skills to generate real-time information of actual consequence and importance to educators working with our nation's children. To do this in real time, not in a journal article that may get read by somebody 10 years later. But I was also disquieted, that means a little bit unnerved, disturbed, by these methodological strands of my early evaluation work at this research center. We were evaluating educational programs that were intended to improve student learning and mastery in particular contexts and subject matter, particular places and times. Even so we were evaluating programs in local contexts, in particular situations. Even so, the kind of evaluation we were doing, particularly the methodological design, was prescribed by distant and standardized federal guidelines. And politicians and policymakers in Washington said this is how you need to do this evaluation, and everybody needs to do it the same way. These prescriptions included requirements to focus our evaluations primarily on the extent to which the stated program objectives were met, using mostly, if not exclusively, quantitative objectivist designs and methods. Further, these requirements were incomprehensibly the same for a new program that was still in the development stage, and for a well-established program that had been around for 10 years. same evaluation guidelines using quantitative post-positivist outcome measurement. The main source of my disquiet, what was perturbing to me, was that the required evaluation information required by my government did serve remote policymakers, but was not relevant to the program directors and the teachers who were working in these programs in these small towns in that part of New England, villages of Rhode Island and Connecticut. These educators wanted to know, how well is this program designed? How well is it being implemented? How are various students experiencing the program? How are different kinds of students experiencing the program? And how well is this program supporting diverse students' learning needs? They had very different kinds of questions, not well answered by traditional methodology. This early work redirected my career from being a professor who does educational psychology research to being a professor who does educational evaluation and evaluation research. This early work also triggered my methodological sensibilities, by which I mean my attention to how method matters in the work that I do, how it matters to what we learn from a study. Then, having had these sensibilities triggered, they were just gloriously enhanced and engaged by what we called the qualitative revolution, which happened soon thereafter, the late 1970s and the 1980s. I don't know what transpired here in your country, but when I say qualitative revolution, it was a time when proponents and experts in a methodology other than the dominant one started spreading the word, spreading the gospel, spreading their wisdom, and offering some alternatives to applied social research and evaluation that were able to answer a question like, how well is it going, this program? Not so much did students master objectives, but how well is it going? What does it look like? How do students experience it? So my own immersion in this qualitative revolution began around 1980, and I had the great good fortune to participate in 2 small working conferences with leaders in the field of qualitative inquiry, including Egon Guba, if you remember that name, Alan Peshkin. My mind is not drawing up the other names, but I could come up with them at some time. Harry Wolcott. And I also joined countless others, I remember this distinctly, in sessions at the American Educational Research Association, AERA, that were just really crowded with people trying to understand and learn about qualitative methodology. There was one telling vignette I'll share about this time. I didn't even quite realize this at the time, but it was in my qualitative learning, very steep learning curve, that I first encountered the word paradigm, or the concept paradigm. And when I learned about the concept of philosophical paradigm, assumptions about knowledge, assumptions about the social world, assumptions about methodology, and which constellation of those can best accomplish what we'd like to accomplish in our work. When I first learned about this, I realized I had been conducting educational evaluation and some research for some years with no acknowledgement nor even awareness of the assumptions that I was bringing to my work. This realization was deeply transformative for me, and it's at the core of my continuing evolving identity as a methodologist. I now strongly believe that close attention, I think it's too hot. Hace mucho calor adentro, yo creo. si quiere abrir la puerta, salga. Ayer hacía mucho calor.
Está perfecto.
Bueno, vamos a perseverar. So through that kind of early experience of saying, wait a minute, I'm bringing a lot of assumptions to phenomena that I'm studying and I'm not even aware of it. And this was very pivotal to my evolving identity as someone who cares about method and pays attention to method. Coming to believe that attention to method is quite important for high quality empirical work. So I was on my way as a qualitative learner, learning about qualitative inquiry, and I got a new job as a real professor and was assigned to teach a course in qualitative methods. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, assigned to teach a course you don't know very much about, but you become a very quick learner at that time. I continued to teach educational program evaluation and conduct evaluation studies, which is my favorite part of my job. And I had this assignment to represent qualitative inquiry in the department and field I was working in. So I was able to promote qualitative inquiry as a very viable, rich, and rewarding path for evaluators of all disciplines and educational researchers in particular. I did have a second moment of methodological disquiet. That first moment, realizing this disjuncture between the federal guidelines for the programs I was evaluating and what seemed to matter to the people in the context. I had a second moment, but I'm going to save that for a little bit later. It's related also to qualitative methods. For now, I position myself partly to illustrate that that's what qualitative inquirers do. We position ourselves in locating ourselves in what we're about to say, so you're aware of where I'm coming from. I also do that so that you know that anything I know about qualitative methodologies comes from my own learning, on my own, with colleagues and reading books and so forth, but I have no formal instruction in this. Many fine co-learners, many excellent tutors, and critical reflections, but it has been a self-taught journey. So I also model this. If people, as we go through the afternoon, would like to say, and here's my location in what I'm about to say, please feel free to. I think it's then now being reflective about what I just said. It's the endless reflections of qualitative inquiry. Why do so many qualitative inquirers feel obligated or feel that it's a good practice to locate ourselves in what we're about to say, the findings of a research study or results of an evaluation study? Why do we feel like that's an important thing to do? What accounts for this particular practice? I'd like to come back to this in proposition number 3. And just leave that for there, that statement of self, and coming back to that in a little bit. So, one last question I'd like to ask, which is not on the translator's text. Why propositions and start with a set of abstract statements? Why start there? My strong belief is that paying attention carefully, intentionally, and thoughtfully to the assumptions we bring to our work makes for better work. If we're very self-observant about what assumptions am I making about this educational program in this particular school, how am I trying to think about it? What stances to the character of the program am I bringing? If it's in a very objectives-based, behavioral objectives-based program, what will I do with my dislike for Skinnerian behaviorism? What do I do with that as an evaluator of a program that's built on behaviorism? And I think the self-knowledge about the assumptions of qualitative work, what we bring as qualitative inquirers to our work as in qualitative inquirers, if we're intentional, thoughtful, and self-conscious about that, we do better work. So that's why I wanted to start with this set of propositions about what qualitative inquiry is. So I'm going to move to the propositions. We will go through the 6 unless we're really bored, and then we'll just move on. After the propositions, I have an example of narrative evaluation, narrative qualitative evaluation. And then I have a few things to say about qualitative analysis traditions, and we'll just see how far we get. So, Proposition 1 is on the nature of the social world that we aim to understand through our inquiry. What are our assumptions about what the social world is like? This is a statement, one response to that question. The social world is structured like the physical world, and thereby, like the physical world, the social world can be nearly fully known and explained. I would like you just to take a minute to yourself or chatting with others, just a minute or two. We'll pause and have you reflect on, yeah, that works for me, or no, it doesn't. Here's how I would change it as a qualitative inquirer. So just take a minute. Feel free to chat with somebody. Does anybody wish to share a thought? Nobody wishes to share? Okay, that's fine. So I will give you my version of the qualitative response. This is what I believe, and the way in which I think about qualitative inquiry. The social world is much more complex than the physical world. If you were here yesterday, you might remember David Berliner's commentary on how much more complex education is than physics and chemistry and geology. So that's the same David Berliner. Harry Wolcott argued, Harry was a long-standing ethnographer, argued that the goal is understanding, not explanation, because the social world is much too complex to explain. A causes B is an explanation. It's much too complex to do that, so we aim to understand. There's the importance of social agency as inquirers, and the inquirer's participation in the knowledge that gets constructed, whether you want to or not, you're there. For some, in qualitative inquiry, this stance of critical realism, the assumptions of critical realism, are some that make sense, and I'll briefly say that Joe Maxwell is one who advocates this. His view, and Donald Campbell, you know of Donald Campbell, also held this position, although it wasn't called critical realism at that time. It's a stance of ontological realism, but epistemological relativism. And that means The belief that the social world does exist, but it's extremely complex, dynamic, and constantly shifting, with constantly shifting and reciprocal influences on our thinking and our behavior. So explanatory knowledge, A causes B, of the social world is quite beyond our grasp. Further, we can only know the social world from our own position in it. That is our participation in the knowledge that gets constructed because we stand somewhere. We don't stand nowhere, independent of everything. And just back to the social agency for 1 minute. I'm back at middle of page 6 for my translators, importance of social agency. Think of it this way. If you study a chemical reaction, your studying it doesn't influence or change that reaction unless you're a sloppy chemist. But if you study interactions among people, your presence, or the presence of the study itself, does indeed influence the interactions that are happening, but in ways far too complex to assess or understand. This can be especially challenging for evaluators. We're supposed to be evaluating a program, but as soon as we're there, it becomes a program with the evaluation on it. So it's not the program independent of an evaluation. We are adding something just by our presence and then by our individual presence as well. Let me go to a second one and then touch base with the group here. So here's a revised version of proposition number 1 for qualitative inquiry as I understand it. The social world is structured differently than the physical world. It is not fixed or stable. It is rather dynamic, infinitely varied and complex, and not fully knowable. So again, the social world is what we're studying. That's the phenomena we're interested in. So how we think about it matters to how we approach it. Let's go through one more. On the nature of important knowledge in social inquiry. Proposition number 2. The highest and most important kind of knowledge that can be generated by social inquiry is causal and propositional knowledge about the laws that govern social behavior and action toward comprehensive theories of human action. So, take a minute or two, say, oh yeah, I agree with that, or I don't. Here's how I would change this. Anybody you want to share? Yeah, part of this exercise is for you to figure out what you like about it or what you don't and differentiate some of our different beliefs. Anybody wish to share a comment? Okay. Well, here's some comments I would make on that. The social world, yes, is complex. We already decided that in the first proposition. And yes, there are some quote-unquote universal or theory-defined aspects or dimensions of the social world that are worth studying in a variety of studies, like The important role of sense of self or self-concept in learning. How best to teach tolerance and acceptance of those who are different from oneself. But what we learn about these important dimensions, important in a large scale, what we learn about these important dimensions of learning in any one study is confined to that particular context, rather than automatically generalizable as a law of human behavior, which is the aspiration of more conventional objectivist science. It is true that consistency in studies of similar kind across time and place can help us think about something like self-concept and its role in learning as pretty important. So it's not that there's nothing that's ever generalizable. I think most of us are educators. We think that one's sense of oneself as a learner is an important component of learning. How we define that, what it looks like in any context may be different. So it's not that nothing is ever generalizable, but we don't generalize as propositional laws. We don't generalize a sense of importance or relationship. I'd also like to point out this notion from William Firestone of analytic generalization. He mentioned this some years ago. I could find the reference to this if anybody's needed, if anybody would like it. He makes the argument that traditional generalization from a sample to a population is not appropriate for qualitative inquiry. That's not how we sample. Nor do we believe that generalization makes sense. We're believing in the contextuality of most human phenomena and the meaningfulness of that phenomena. Sometimes we do case-to-case generalization, from this case study to another place, but only with very close attention to the similarities and differences between the cases. Bill Firestone says, well, we, qualitative inquirers, can think about analytic generalization in a third way, which is the logical exercise of generalizing the particular results of a study to a broader body of research or a broader theory. So it's not saying everybody will do this, but it's generalizing a set of results to a theory or a broader area of research. And he reminds us that if we would want to do that, generalize a set of results to a theory or a line of research, this provides evidence that supports the theory, but certainly does not prove it. We could have a whole other conversation here about what we mean by theory. So we can, if anybody wishes. So the assumptions instead of this kind of theory-oriented grand generalization aspiration of post-positivist science, most qualitative inquiry traditions believe, maintain, that the social world as we experience it is constructed by people in interaction with one another in particular contexts. Meaning-making and knowledge of the social world is constructed in action and in context. In a different context, the meaning would be different. We make meaning as we navigate our surroundings, like that. Understanding individual and collective constructions of meaning are therefore the major focus and purpose, the goal of qualitative inquiry. As we believe that it is these constructions of meaning, how I'm making meaning in a particular context, that shape behavior. And there's about 40 people. We're having about 40 different constructions of meaning at this particular moment in time. And those who aren't finding it very meaningful will leave. And those who are finding it meaningful might stay, or you'll get distracted, look at your phone, you know. I mean, this is the theory. So it's important to remember these constructions are intersubjective, contextual, and dynamic. Definitely contextual, both within and across cultures. Very considered attention to cultural differences in this tradition. And again, we aim not for generalizable causal claims, but for contextually and culturally relevant understanding of people's constructions of meanings in the context they inhabit. Again, these constructions are what guide and steer human behavior. So our knowledge of the social world is not law-governed or generalizable, but inevitably constructed, contextual, impermanent, and partial. Which is why we have such low status in so many social science communities. So, should we go on with these propositions? I see yes, yes. Well, we have, so that's the revisited proposition. Again, knowledge is constructed, contextual, impermanent, and partial. I think 3 and 4 go together. So it's on the role of strong methodology in social inquiry. With strong methodology, social laws in social inquiry can be strongly warranted and generalized widely. Possible influences of the inquirer, the researcher or evaluator, on the data collection, analysis, and reporting can be minimized. So that's the role of strong methodology. Number 3 we've kind of covered. But method contributes to number 3 in important ways. So again, just a minute or 2 to say, oh yes, I agree, no, I would change it in these ways. This fits my practice, no, I do something completely different. How many people here work with colleagues who are strong, quantitative, post-positivist researchers or evaluators? Okay. So you're familiar with what I'm about to say. I see my colleagues who work in traditional educational research division. Some of them, they do large-scale secondary data analysis. Large data sets from our government and do analysis of those data sets to answer particular questions. In that line of work, it's very important to control for bias and error. Strong methodology enables powerful analysis, permits the generation of generalization and significant findings. Some of the key parts of strong methodology are randomization and sampling. Without randomization, we can't generalize. Small error terms in survey results. We want very good estimates. Meticulously careful statistical analyses, filling all the assumptions of the test. Fulfillment of the core criteria in post-positivist inquiry: validity, reliability, objectivity, and generalizability. In qualitative traditions, that's what I just said, sorry. All of this serves to protect the inquiry from the inquirer. That's part of the object. Good method in qualitative inquiry is about something else. Respectful presence, keen observation, access to the insider perspective, and insight. Not so much about controlling for bias or error. Bias and error are inevitable. We can't look at something and see it as it really is. So they're inevitable. If Maria Jesus and I studied the same thing, we would talk about it differently. So call that bias and error, call that the wisdom of different qualitative interpreters. We have a very different way of thinking about the methodologies of our work. We want to be aware of bias and error. It can happen, but not to control them, because that's not possible. So good qualitative inquiry has a different set of priorities. It's about insight more than it's about controlling for bias and error. So how do we recognize good inquiry when we see it? How do we warrant our inferences? How do we get strong methodology so that we have some confidence that our inferences have some resonance and value in the context we're studying? Again, from Harry Wolcott, we offer some insightful understanding that makes sense, helps to tell the story. Kuba and Lincoln trustworthiness criteria, which you may be familiar with. These are not well regarded by many qualitative inquirers because they're too close to quantitative post-positivist criteria. I'm a program evaluator. The clients that I work for very often want some assurance about the quality of the data, and I find these useful in that context. But again, qualitative inquiry, all traditions, are non-foundational epistemologies, meaning there's no place we can stand and see truth. Everything we see is colored by who we are as an inquirer. In qualitative traditions, the inquirer is inevitably present in the results of the inquiry. There's no possibility of removing us completely from the data collected